because you have too much protein, maybe not the greatest idea in the world. 2 guns to shoot zombies with, a bunch of bullets for each gun, but you decide to just have 1 gun and pack way more bullets. And at some point, you kind of wish you'd have the other gun to shoot zombies this way and that way, as opposed to just 1 gun and more bullets than you could use.
Welcome to a new episode with ASTRID, your APD. I am having an amazing guest, and I think you know already who he is, Mike Israetel. We're going to go deep in a lot of different questions, true and false, this or that, underrated, overrated, obviously on nutrition and training and different topics around that. How are you?
Good, how are you?
Oh, well, I just woke up. I had just been sleeping for about 5.5 hours. Used to be prioritizing sleep, but it is a little bit of we recommend people sleeping a lot, but sometimes we don't do it.
Sure.
How have you been?
Good, I'm very well. I'm very well.
I'm excited to have a chat to you today about a few different questions that I prepared for you. I have 2 first general questions that are not necessarily that specific. So the first one is, when eating too much protein, when becomes too much? Eating protein is not necessarily, has been demonstrated that it's not necessarily deleterious for your health, but when it could become a problem, when we do eat way too much protein?
So I think the beginning of a good answer is when you're eating more protein is beneficial, and also that it impinges on how much carbohydrate and fat you can have, and thus maybe doesn't cause the best adaptation. So for example, contest bodybuilders sometimes like to eat 2 grams of protein per pound of body weight per day, or something like 4 per kilo per day. And that's fine by itself, but the question is, how much carbohydrate do you have to cut out in order to do that? Let's assume that they're keeping enough fats in to meet all their hormonal requirements and things like that. What ends up happening is, like, you're getting lots of protein, that's cool, but after a certain point, probably about 1 gram per pound per day, you're not really having any benefit. And then you're maybe eating half of the carbohydrates you could. And especially on a diet that's designed to promote fat loss and muscle retention, carbohydrates are very, very retentive of muscle. And as a matter of fact, probably more retentive muscle after you've already had all of your protein that you can use. So that's a problem. Another one is that carbohydrates potentiate performance in training and recovery from training in a huge way. They also promote good sleep. If you had enough carbs through the day, you can sleep better than if you're on a very low carb diet. What ends up happening is, like, because of all these advantages of carbs and you're eating too few carbs because you have too much protein, it's like maybe not the greatest idea in the world. If you have like potentially 2 guns to shoot zombies with and a bunch of bullets for each gun, but you decide to just have 1 gun and pack way more bullets, and at some point, you kind of wish you'd have the other gun to shoot zombies this way and that way, as opposed to just 1 gun and more bullets than you could use. Maybe you can throw the bullets at the zombies. I don't know. Maybe you can throw protein at your friends. But that's one big impingement. And another big impingement I can think of is there's a psychological element to diet consistency, and part of that is kind of enjoyment. This is especially true. It's true to some extent during fat loss diets, but sometimes we get so hungry it doesn't matter. We'll eat anything that's presented to us. Eating all the food's not a problem. But if you're intelligently programming dieting, you're going to have some maintenance phases. You're going to have some maybe muscle gain phases. And if you're eating a ton of protein, it can actually make eating food a very unenjoyable process, because there's like a certain amount of protein and carbs and fats that in a certain ratio makes your food taste very good, and also allows you to eat a lot of regular foods, or at least macro-friendly versions of regular foods. But if you have to have tons and tons of protein, it pushes the carbs and fats so low that all of a sudden it's just not that fun to just cram chicken breasts down your throat, where you could just be doing more pasta and more olive oil and Parmesan cheese, which is way easier to eat. And if you're getting enough protein, after that, eating more of those tasty macros can just make a difference between enjoying your diet a lot and sort of viewing it like it's a very laborious thing. And there's only so long you can view a diet as laborious until it presents itself as no longer appealing for you to use. And that's why there's kind of a downside. And the last one, a tiny little one, it doesn't affect that many people, but it affects precisely the people that often try to eat a lot of protein. If you're trying to gain muscle, a lot of times the higher the appetite that you can muster, the better, especially when your body weight starts to get really outside of its normal range and your appetite tends to shrink. Protein is one of the hardest macronutrients. It depends on how you slice it. More nuanced version of this conversation, but protein on average is probably the harder macronutrient to eat. That is, it fills you up the most. And if you're eating double the protein that you need, it's just going to be really hard to hit your calories and gain weight. I've actually known some people personally who were trying to gain mass, and they were doing it with tons and tons of protein, and they largely failed to put on a lot of weight because they couldn't eat enough calories. And they'll say, oh man, I'm so full, I have no idea how to eat this many calories. Well, if I'm allowed to eat a lot of carbs and fats, I can pound tons of calories. But if you have to eat double protein, man, you just get full so quick. So I think that's one of the reasons why maybe too much protein can be a bad thing. Not directly, but indirectly, as you kind of implied in your question.
Doing a follow-up question about gaining weight and especially being in a surplus, you mentioned that it could be a problem just having way too much protein because it's very satiating and it can be very challenging for so many people to gain weight or eat more calories. But what's true behind the statement that maybe if you're in a surplus, eating more protein could lead to less fat gain?
People have times said that protein is not very lipogenic. The evidence for that is not very direct, and I would say not very convincing. They point to something called rabbit starvation or rabbit hunger, where various indigenous populations or temporary populations in wartime ate a lot of really lean meats, tons and tons of protein, and it doesn't matter how much of them they ate, they were unable to put on body fat, unable to become healthy again, and were still super skinny. That kind of very indirect observational literature is not overly convincing. In addition to that, unless you're eating exclusively lean protein, that's it. Any amount of protein that you eat higher than what you need, and if you go in way too many calories, what's going to happen is even if that protein is not directly put into body fat, which some of it probably will be anyway, it's going to push the carbs and fats you're eating into that surplus, and then they will be more likely to be added as fat. So I think that if you're eating remotely a mixed diet of proteins, carbs, and fats, which you should be, then eating more protein and adding that many calories in an indirect way at least, and probably some in a direct way, will still cause fat gain. I still have yet to see anyone throw out a study in which people were hypercaloric under controlled conditions, having way more protein fed, and failed to gain a measurable amount of body fat. And there were some studies where the free-feeding populations were given instructions to eat more protein. I believe in some studies by Professor Antonio in Florida. I'm just not entirely willing to bet that those people were eating what they said they were. It's a very curious outcome that occurred in those studies where people gained lots of muscle and didn't gain a lot of body fat, ostensibly eating a lot more calories than would be their maintenance. But I would like to see that series of studies replicated several times under much tighter controlled conditions before I was willing to kind of modify a lot of what we know about nutritional biochemistry. So there's different hierarchies of evidence, and that's not very quality evidence. There's a possibility that protein is just very unlikely to be put into body fat, but again, that indirect mechanism of pushing your carbs and fat in to be stored, because if all you eat is protein or you eat tons and tons of protein, your necessity for burning carbs and fats declines. Protein is burned preferentially, and then carbs and fats are probably stored as body fat. It's very difficult to get away from eating a hypercaloric diet and not putting on body fat if you go right down to it.
I agree with that. Let me ask you one more question, and I guess it is more related to cutting. When you are cutting and eating a very high amount of volume foods and high fiber, what do you do or how do you do to not be farting all day?
Man, fuck if I know. I fart all the time. I don't care. I don't go out in public. I don't have any friends. My wife wears a gas mask at all times. Fart away. Yeah, I have no answer to that question. Maybe you have an answer, but it's actually never concerned me in the least. I will say that I have a pretty adaptable gastric system, I think. So I can eat 5 Quest bars and not fart any extra than normal. But it takes a little while to get used to. But I'm so used to eating a bunch of crap and all kinds of sugar alcohols that my farting is generally at a pretty good baseline level.
Oh, that's good. I asked this question because I have seen and I have had consultations with clients that are addressing this very question, and they're concerned that if they eat more fiber, they tend to be bloated more and have more farts. So I just wanted to hear your opinion about that.
Sure. I mean, that's probably true. I've seen it happen in friends of mine that are dieting for bodybuilding. They will fart significantly more, sometimes have gastrointestinal problems, bloating, especially the lower GI tract, but comes with the territory, at least as far as I have ever thought about that.
That's all right. Let's move to true and false. And the first question I've got here is, there is a statement of obesity is a choice. What do you have to say about this? Do you feel like this is true? Is it false? Is it partly false? Where do you stand in this?
So I'd say it's false, but I can give a lot more background. Almost no one chooses to be obese, short of sumo wrestlers and potential fat fetishists, but a huge fraction of people choose to have unending quantities of highly obesogenic junk food without much concern for the outcome. It is a choice they make, and they make it all the time. In the sense that all the time, I mean they make it every meal, every day, every week, etc. So they're not choosing to be obese because they're not if given a button to press, obese or not obese, they're not going to press the obesity button. But if given a button to press like pizza and Doritos and Coke versus apples and protein bars and broccoli, well, we know they press the junk food button all the time. So while they're not directly choosing, obesity. In a sense, they are choosing something that leads down the path of obesity quite reliably. Per the current conflict in Ukraine, perhaps a politically incorrect but yet apt analogy would be, does a leader choose war? No, he chooses invasion. And if the forces were allowed to enter unopposed, there would be no war. Just, you're in charge now, nobody shoots back, that's cool. But, when you invade a sovereign country, generally they fight back. So, yeah, in a sense, you could say, well, you are really choosing war. In a sense, people who are choosing to eat tons and tons of junk food and sort of not making the choice to care about it, almost their lack of choice leads to the only thing happening is they actually end up getting quite overweight. And I know that the genesis of this question is perhaps, if I'm guessing correctly, but I've seen this in memes a lot. People on the political right tend to say shit like obesity is a choice. And people on the political left tend to relish in the fact that they're technically wrong, and they are technically wrong. But while they're technically wrong, if you give a little bit of leeway to the spirit of what they're saying, yeah, the vast majority of obese people have a variety of choices they can be making every day. And often they make choices that do not help their cause at all as far as getting less obese. Now, that's a complex discussion because sometimes they make pretty decent choices that most of us make, but due to their lifestyle or due to their genetics, they end up obese anyway, and other people don't. It's always funny to hear critiques about body fat and obesity from just like skinny assholes that eat like shit all the time. They're like, that people just have no willpower as they eat more chips. Like, shut the fuck up. Neither do you, man. You just got lucky. Just your hunger signaling is just not that profound. There's not like obese people, not all of them have like a profoundly less willpower or something. Although I would say that with regards to restricting food intake, my guess would be that wildly overweight people probably on average have less willpower as it relates to food, which is just a statement of fact. It's not a moral judgment. It's just this shit is how it is. And I think because we know that about them statistically, we need to meet folks like that where they are with compassion and say, hey, listen, like, I get it. It's fucking hard to eat healthy and fucking blows, but let me try to give you some tools to get a little bit better at what you're doing. And sometimes they care and say, yes, please help. And sometimes they say, what? Fuck you. I'm going to eat Oreos. And then you're okay. I tried my best. And it's going to happen like that.
I think you are in the right place when you say that, yeah, it is partially, like, it is false because it's not necessarily a choice, but there are things that are impacting that person's lifestyle, that person's choices. And also, like you said, there are other things like hormonal imbalances, genetics, and things that might make things harder for that person to change. And also, like, partially could be lack of education or lack of tools that can help that person to get in a much better place. And sometimes there are things around us or external factors that we might not be able to manage all at once, or like our lifestyle, our external environment, the people we live with, or our financial state, I don't know, things like that can make things even harder for you to perhaps try to not be obese.
Yeah, definitely. Some of those things go a long way, some don't. Some of these assumptions we can make about obesity and the influences there. Is it okay if I'm waxing on this for a while, or do you want to just cut me off and tell me to go to the next question? So I have a little bit more to say, if that's okay.
No, go for it.
Some of the presupposed factors that increase the probability of obesity in a causal mechanism, there's not really much evidence for them, and some of the evidence goes the other way around. So one dead horse I like to beat all the time is the relationship between income and obesity. And people will say that, if you don't have the means to reduce your obesity, financially wealthy enough, then it's difficult to reduce your obesity. That to me is, at face value, always sounded very strange, because I was under the impression that, food costs money, and the more money you have, the more food you can buy. And people say, well, junk food is cheap. And then I think, okay, well, a rich person can buy a lot of junk food then, and a poor person maybe just a little bit, or maybe just some. This has been studied empirically. And it actually turns out that the causality between obesity and poverty is backwards. Obese people actually tend to get poorer over time. Poor people don't tend to get obese in a causal mechanism. There's at least one review of literature that I've seen that actually addressed this distinct thing. Another one is education. I'm not exactly so sure what you're supposed to be learning in school that teaches you to be leaner. I did school as far as anyone ever has. Way postgraduate. I don't know what I didn't know when I was like about 10. If I eat a ton of food that I really like, it tastes really good, and I just eat, I tend to gain weight. And if I just active more and eat the shit that I know is healthy, like almost everyone, like fruits and veggies. If you go do a survey around most of the least educated places in the world, most people can discriminate between relatively healthy and unhealthy food. There's almost nowhere in the world where you're like, hey, here's fries and a shake. This is good for you. Most people are like, no, that's junk. It's okay, here's an apple and a piece of chicken. Good? And they're like, yeah, it's better. And most people know that, but I think the big determining factor, other than, genetics and stuff like that, and just hunger signaling for people who are overfat or not overfat, is how much they care about that sort of thing. A lot of people that are over fat, it's just not their priority to care about their body much, or certainly not enough to change it. On the one hand, we can say, well, that's bad, we should care. Maybe we're right. On the other hand, it's like, well, people have different priorities, and why not live a little bit of the good life and have a bunch of tasty snacks? And like, imagine someone dying at age 65 and they ate all the food they ever wanted, had a great life, versus someone else dying at 75 and all they did was die their whole fucking life. I'm not so sure which one of those is better, but I think there's a pretty complex tapestry of things going on, and it's tempting to be like a super right-winger and just judge the fuck out of people and say they're all fucked up and they have low willpower and they just need to nut up, and that's probably wrong. And then there's also the temptation on the left to just like blanket everything, spray it with compassion. It's never anyone's fault. Nothing's ever your fault. And that's not true. Some stuff's your fault. Some stuff's society's fault. And it's a big interplay between that.
Perfect. I think that is a really great explanation for that particular topic. And there is so much nuance and back and forth on that particular topic that I know it could be a bit sensitive for a lot of people. I know you had a really good thing to say about that. Now, let's move to another statement, true or false. And this is, if you have a healthy body fat, you can get away with most things. Do you think that's true or false?
Most things in look like you can kill a person in broad daylight and not go to jail? What do you mean get away with most things?
I guess it's more about like, if you're in a healthy body fat, probably you could just be healthier, less likely to disease or to death or things like that.
A lower body fat is probably one of the biggest variables that can change within a human's life, or at the body fat level of a human being. It's probably one of the biggest variables that can change in your life that affects your prospective health outcome. So for example, if you have a body fat percent of 70 or something, insanely morbidly obese, yeah, gee whiz, your trips to the doctor are not going to be fun, because they're going to look at your blood work and be like, you're gonna die tomorrow, probably tomorrow, right? Real bad news. And it affects almost every organ system in very, very bad ways. On the other hand, if you're relatively lean, all things being equal, that is really, really huge effector, or rather, it really allows you to stay relatively healthy, much healthier than if you had been, grossly over fat. Although there are, again, tons of nuances. Just one example is, how do you get lean, or how do you stay lean? Because if your way to get lean is like some combination of heroin and cigarettes, like, I don't know, man, those are going to impact you a whole lot more. But, if you're like over fat to some extent, but you're also a competitive powerlifter and you're super physically active, like you can actually be quite healthy with not a ton of extra fat, but quite a bit. So, if you take any random two people on the street, a guy with 7% is a crack addict and the guy with 25% is a competitive strongman, that strongman is probably going to be healthier than the crack addict. But most times in general population, adiposity is a very, very big predictor of health. And it's one that varies and one we can often change, at least to some extent. So it pays paying attention to. I'm not a general practitioner, a physician, but if I had somebody come into my office that was very, very obese, I would be inclined to ask them a few questions and run a few tests that I maybe would not be so inclined for a person that was not obese, unless they complained of some health malady or the regular blood work came up as having flags.
Do you think that most people don't train hard enough? Like, is it lack of education, fear of injury, lack of a good training program? Is it true or is it false?
Oh, I'm not sure. I actually just don't know. I think that there's an interesting kind of bimodality to it. I think the vast majority of females don't train hard enough, mostly for what are called neuroendocrinological reasons. Female brain paired with low to non-existent levels of testosterone means that grit of just like, I'm going to fucking burn in my own flames is often just not there as much. And that makes females generally very safe people to be around. It means they have fewer traffic offenses. They're less likely to, hit you in the face for no reason after an argument. But it also means they're not as good at, going close to failure or something like that. Although I do think females are usually better at consistency with their programs, which is kind of another way of hard if you think about it. On the other hand, there like lots of young males, specifically, high school and college age males, I think in any one given session, they often train too hard with no regard of how they're going to plan other sessions in the future. And they end up getting more hurt more often. They have to deload more often. Deload, to them, they don't know that term. It's just like they get really tired of training and they skip a bunch of sessions and then motivation sinks and it comes back up. So I think it really depends a ton on the group. I would say on average, if I had to put money on it, I would say people don't train hard enough by a small margin. But I think it really pays to figure out which group you're talking about.
Lifting weights burns more calories than cardio. True or false?
False. Cardio usually burns way more calories, and that's even if you take into account the exercise oxygen consumption, the EPOC effect, or it's also called the afterburn effect. The lifting is just doesn't really burn a ton of calories, although if you lift in a particular way, compound alternating antagonistic supersets with very few rest periods, you can burn lots of calories, but that comes at a very big fatigue cost compared to most kinds of cardio, including like incline walking even. So cardio does burn more calories, but lifting as a standalone, because it grows muscle and burns fat at the same time, has a bigger impact on your body composition and probably your health over the long term. So if someone said, hey, listen, I have 3 total hours per week to exercise, I just don't care what kind of exercise it is. I like all exercise. What should I do? I'd say, yeah, it's just almost all of it, if not all of it, should be resistance training, lifting weights. But if they said, look, I have 6 hours, then maybe 4 hours of that resistance training and 2 hours of that would be cardio. And the sort of the more time you have to it, depending on your goals, you can incorporate more cardio. So because lifting weights builds muscle and does a decent amount of calorie burning, and cardio builds almost no muscle, but does more, significantly more, but not like triple or something, calorie burning, then, cardio technically, yes, burns more calories, but in the context of what I would recommend as the training modality, if you want to look better, lifting is going to take a first priority in most cases. And a little unfortunate, that's the reality compared to what most people actually do, because specifically, and this affects a lot of females. Females will say, okay, so Dr. Mike said cardio, so I'm just going to do a ton of cardio. Yeah, like if you want to end up pretty thin, and for people at work to ask you if you got sick, sure. But if you start lifting weights and control your diet a little bit, then you can end up at what, most people call sexy, I guess, not all. And then you have a different set of problems at work with, the guy from accounting is like, hey, what are you doing tonight? You're like, get the fuck out of my face, Jim. And you have to buy a gun. You have to show Jim your gun. You know the rest.
Okay. The larger the deficit, the more volume you should aim for preventing muscle loss.
Yeah, that's generally true. The problem is that one of those extinguishes the other. So large deficit actually reduces your maximum recoverable volume. So generally speaking, yes, you have to have a large training volume to counteract the deficit. But as the deficit goes up, the MRV goes down. There's going to be a point in which they meet. And if you go over that, you get really overreached like crazy. So what I would say is practically don't make a ton of assumptions about like, oh, I should do this much volume in order to counteract muscle loss. Start with a lower amount of volume and work your way up to see where that volume is going to match your deficit in keeping the muscle loss to a minimum. And another thing is that because of that MRV problem and a few other problems, that doesn't mean you should just crank the deficit and crank the volume and expect for your best results. You can essentially overburden the system, and all you'll do is just burn out. So I would say establish a moderate deficit, establish a moderate training volume, auto-regulated, of course, to adapt, and then that's probably where you get your best results.
Okay. Is there any easy way, like a practical way that people should be utilizing to know where the maximal recover volume is?
Yeah. So you just continue to train week on week on week. And then, periodically you would have to increase your volume in order to get a better stimulus. And at some point, you're going to reach a point where you can't continue to progress and you actually start to get weaker. You just feel super tired and weak. You stop hitting PRs and you note sort of what training volumes you're at. I was doing 20 sets of back and 15 sets for chest. Wow, you write them down. You deload, take your volumes back to what you think maintenance volume is or minimum effective volume. And then over the next mesocycle, work back up. And then when you hit, again, a point of you can't progress in your lifts anymore and you actually start to get weaker, cut it off, deload, take a look at what those numbers are. And if they're pretty close to the numbers you did this past meso, like, okay, well, it looks like 2 times in a row, around 20 sets a week, I get to my back training. The next week after that, my back just cuts out. It's no good. And I really start to fall behind in my performance. And you start to think, well, my MRV might be around 20 sets per week for back.
Got it. Now let's move to this or that. The first question is, if you have a craving, should you satisfy it or starve it?
In the context of what kind of diet?
Let's say fat loss.
For most people, I would say don't give in to the craving because that's just going to result in more of that craving amplified during a fat loss diet. During a muscle gain diet, in the context of meeting your weekly macros and calorie goals, I say absolutely give in. I don't know what you're thinking. It's not a huge temptation. Do what your cravings say and eat a whole pizza, but you got to roll the pizza up like a burrito and eat it like this, the whole thing, because that way it burns more calories.
Okay. I think I asked this question because there is these two camps. Like if you have a craving, probably if you're in a fat loss and you're thinking about something, then perhaps you think about eating, well, I'm going to ignore it, so I'm going to have a salad. But then you're still thinking about the chocolate, but you ate the salad and you think about the chocolate still. And then so you kind of try to waver around and eat a piece of gum, but you're still thinking about the chocolate. And at the end of the day, you end up eating the chocolate. So you end up eating more calories at the end of the day than if you just had eaten just the chocolate. Or there is other camp to say, well, if you starve it, you ignore it, it is going, as you said, it's going to be much more positive because you're just going to not have that temptation or likelihood of eating more of it. So I don't know. What is your stance on this?
Yeah, I'm going to be that asshole that says I take the third way, a different option altogether, and say recognize your craving. Understand that your craving is a craving, and ask yourself, is satisfying my craving going to increase my probability of diet success? Is it actually going to crush my craving, or is satisfying it going to rebound me into wanting just to do more of this thing? Is it going to be putting me in line with my goals? And if the answer is, let's say, there's all kinds of answers there. If you can honestly tell yourself from prior experience, like, look, if I just have a piece of chocolate, I won't want it for a long time, maybe even weeks, and I can fit it into my macros, no big deal, then hey, yeah, chocolate away. But if you say to yourself, look, if I have a piece of chocolate, I'm just going to have the whole fucking bag, and then I'm just going to cry and cry and cry, and it's going to take me further away from my goals. But if I just move along with my day and recognize that I want chocolate, breathe in, breathe out, realize that I'm not a child, I don't have to do everything I feel like, namaste, right? And then I just move on, and after a few minutes, a few hours, the chocolate craving will go away. I'll wake up the next morning and be like, fuck yeah, I did it. So if that's your answer, then you can feel free to recognize, again, not ignore, but don't act on the craving. That's my best answer.
No, I think it is exactly what I would do, is teaching that skill of understanding why do you craving things in the first place. Probably something that you like, but does that aligns with your goals right now? Is it something that if you do it is going to lead to for you to feel satisfied and happy about that decision, or is actually going to bring negative connotation or negative emotions or guilt or shame around,
Sure.
well, I gave into this craving, now I just further away from achieving my goals. So it's just a fine line. All right, second question, if you had to choose between training for strength or training for aesthetics and size, what would you choose?
I think I made that choice. I'm training for aesthetics and size. I used to train for
Okay.
strength all the time. I used to compete in powerlifting, but I actually just like training for higher reps more. I like the pump. I like the burn. I like the look. And it's like I'm genetically not very suited for bodybuilding. I've kind of like a not so aesthetically pleasing body, but it's a passion of mine. So that's kind of where I stand. But strength training is super, super fun in a way that hypertrophy training never can be. I mean, there's something really awesome about like picking up loads heavier than you ever thought you would, and your spine kind of compressing under the squat, even as you unrack it. Like it's really cool stuff.
Can you train for both, or kind of find a happy medium, or
Yeah.
not really?
Me personally, or just a person in general?
I would say like for the general person, but like for you as well.
For me, no, because I'm optimizing for bodybuilding. But for a person in general, yeah, you just have to understand that optimization of any one has to come at the expense of optimization of any other. So if you want to train for a bit of both, it's cool, and you'll get a bit of both, but that's the thing, a bit of both, not the most of both that you could. So for example, if you really care about winning your next bodybuilding show, I would at least take a 6-month break from strength training to try to put your best foot forward. If you really care about doing well in your powerlifting meet, I wouldn't do bodybuilding rep ranges alongside your powerlifting training, because then, nobody cares what you look like on that platform. It's only your total speaks for you. So just understand what you want, understand the trade-offs, and if you're okay with the trade-offs, then go to it.
Perfect. Compounds or isolated exercise first?
Whichever exercise gives you the best stimulus to fatigue ratio and it most aligns with a priority of which muscle group you want to train should probably go first. But if you are an individual that is really looking for as much raw stimulus magnitude as possible, often compounds do that better. If you're an individual that wants to keep your total fatigue down and are okay with a reduced raw stimulus magnitude, but a better stimulus to fatigue ratio, isolations first, compounds second, often, but not always, does that a little better.
Spending more time dieting or more time at maintenance?
Well, I think the goal for most of us is to spend most of our time at maintenance, because dieting is the act of getting to somewhere. And much of the time, it's that place we want to be that makes us really happy. So for most people, I think they just want to live at maintenance. They diet to get to a certain look that they want to live at maintenance at. So I think that for most people over the course of multiple years or maybe their lives, more time at maintenance is a really good idea. Time during cutting or fat loss should be very dedicated, distinct time. There's time, I'm going to get this done, and then I'm going to go to maintenance. And there's also a thing where like a lot of female fitness folks, they're just kind of chronically trying to diet all the time. And it can really do an interesting number on your psychology and physiology after a while. So I think at some point you got to pick a body weight you want to be good at. And then you have to alternate, if you want to get leaner and more muscular close to that body weight, you have to also throw in massing in there. You have to do some massing and some cutting and some maintenance, all in more or less even proportions. But it also means it depends on how much you want to change your body. So for example, if you want to really make big changes, you're going to do a lot of massing, a lot of cutting, and some maintenance in order to cool off those processes to potentiate them further. If you want to just be at a certain, very healthy body weight and have fun, live life, then mostly it's going to be maintenance.
Okay. Split squats or two-legged squats?
Two very different exercises. I actually target very different muscle groups. I prefer two-legged squats. Anything I get from split squats, I get from walking lunges. But split squats are brutal, and they can really mess up your glutes, especially a ton, and also your adductors. It's the balancing and the keeping the knee from going into varus position that actually stresses your adductors a ton. I think split squats are a hidden adductor gem if you want big inner thighs.
Okay. Best fuel for your brain, carbs or fats?
Carbs. There's not really much debate about that. The literature is very clear that carbs are the best fuel for the brain, at least in the acute sense that if you have carbohydrate, psychological mood and your cognitive performance tends to improve more acutely than if you have a bunch of fats.
I totally agree. I just asked this question because I've seen quite a few low-carb zealots saying you don't really need carbs and you can just thrive and your brain thrives on fats.
Low-carb zealots often say the darndest things, don't they? It's just like a repository of crazy shit to justify their stupid diet.
Last question on this category, food quality or food quantity for fat loss?
Oh, for fat loss. I thought you meant it's just a preference. Quantity beats everything for fat loss. I don't care if you're eating whole food, organic, vegan, homemade recipes. You eat too much of that shit, you will get fat and you won't get lean. And if you eat just total shit food, but you don't eat enough of it, you will lose lots of weight and you will get lean.
Okay. For you, to what point quality becomes very, very important?
So if you have your quantity down, quality is one of the steps below that to check off. Quality also can support your health in a way that quantity can't. And quality can make the diet sustainable and enjoyable in a way that quantity can't. Quality can also decrease how much hunger signaling is going on. So for example, if you just eat mostly junk food, but you reduce its quantity, you're going to be starving to death, or it's going to feel like it on a low-calorie diet. But if you eat a diet mostly of high-fiber foods, high-protein foods, very satiating foods, that's a quality metric, then you're actually going to be pretty successful and not going to feel very hungry, even though you're at a very major deficit. So that's you should attend to quantity primarily, but once you have the quantity that you want, you should increase its quality as much as you can to get what you want out of it. For example, anti-hunger potential.
Now, moving to over and underrated. The first one is bread. Is it overrated or underrated?
Underrated. Bread is great. It's whole grain bread especially is very healthy for you. Refined processed bread is a great mass gaining tool post-workout. Bread tastes great. It goes well with a trillion other foods. It's incredibly demonized, again, by the low-carb people for, again, no good reason. And bread's amazing. Listen, the French, they have got life all figured out. They drink 10 bottles of wine a day, 18 cigarettes an hour, and somehow they're still healthy. I think it's the French bread. I'm just kidding, but French bread is delicious.
What about machine exercises? Are they overrated or underrated?
Probably underrated by many people. There is a magic to free weight movements. I think there is a magic to free weight movements, but it's marginal magic. It's just a little bit more magical. And they sometimes say, well, you shouldn't be using machines, or, you shouldn't, it's like a crutch. I don't know, a crutch for what? I don't know. I didn't know I was training to be a free weight, operator. So a lot of times there's this almost like a dogmatic resistance to machines. I don't think warranted in many cases.
Most underrated or undertrained muscle group you see in females?
The tibialis anterior. I'm just kidding. That's a joke. Can you imagine? The first thing people notice about you if you're wearing a dress. Well, speaking from my own personal perspective on sexual attractiveness, if I may be so frank, the hamstrings. Because especially in jeans, most girls know to train their glutes, and that's fine. Glutes look great. But if you have a girl with some big ass hams and some nice glutes, that changes the whole picture. All of a sudden, you don't even know what your name is. She comes up to talk to you. You don't know what to say. You throw up. That's happened to me numerous times.
And what about for males?
Is the penis a muscle? No, I don't think it is. I don't have any answers. The most underrated muscle group for males. I haven't given this thought to this question. I will say the forearms, actually, because the forearms are visible in a variety of outfits. And it's something that, when you shake someone's hand, you instantly notice. And some meaty forearms, that can look kind of cool. If I was a woman and a man shook my hand and he had big forearms, I would be wondering what he's up to later that day. That's all I'm going to say.
Okay. And what about going to the other extreme? What is the most overrated exercise or muscle group for females?
Abs. I'm going to say this once, and it's only a personal opinion, but I think it's also quite representative. I have actually spoken to approximately 2 guys out of the million that I've ever spoken to that pays any attention to a girl's abs. And ostensibly, at least some small fraction of why females train is to look good for the opposite sex or same sex, doesn't matter. I have a shitload of lesbian friends, and they had never in a million years mentioned that they're interested in a girl's abs. Now, girls love to train their abs because I think there's something going on there where they actually like how guys' abs look. They think, oh, abs are good because I'm attracted to them and I'm going to have my own abs. Like, I've had tons of clients over the years be like, I want a six-pack. And I'm like, why? Does J-Lo have a six-pack? And they're like, I don't know. Exactly. Nobody knows. Nobody cares. Like if you, I'm sorry, forgive me. It's very, very uncivilized of me. But if you like do a category search of like what people click on for adult film searches, like porn searches, who the fuck abs? Abs? That's like the 150th on the list. Ass is like number one, thighs, etc. So yeah, females over prioritize their abs like crazy. There are people that love them and they're super great, rock on. It looks awesome. No matter what your abs look like, you look good. But I mean, just statistically, let's say a girlfriend of mine came up to me and she's like, look, I want this guy. Here's his photograph. I want to attract him. What the fuck do I have to look like to do it? I wouldn't even talk about abs. Abs would not be in her training plan. It would be way other stuff.
And what about for males? Same question.
Weight training in general, women fundamentally don't give a shit if you weight train or not. But I'll keep this line because I chose specifically to talk about sexual attractiveness as far as why people lift. So I'll just staying within that realm. I would say traps. Men love the way big traps look. Women generally either don't notice them or think they look kind of grotesque. Very few women, in my experience, like, I need a man with no neck. Girl, so hot. You don't really hear that often. But men love them. Like, what was his name? Tom Hardy in the movie Warrior. He had like big traps, and every guy's like, "Oh my god, I want that." But like, a lot of guys will come up to you and compliment you on your big traps. Not so many ladies.
When we think about TRT, is this overrated or underrated?
Overrated, and I'll tell you why. The vast majority of people that ask about TRT are men that produce a very decent or high level of natural testosterone, and they're just going to like feel identical, except they're going to need to inject themselves twice a week all the time. Not enough people who need TRT ask about it. Way more people ask about TRT than need it. And a lot of people think it's this magical elixir. Like, oh my God, I'm going to get out TRT and fucking get huge. No, you're not. You're going to look like slightly above average or just average, because that's what testosterone replacement therapy does. To get huge, you need super physiological doses, which are not fun, fuck up your health, fuck up your psychology. You will get jacked, but it's not TRT. So I think TRT is overrated because, first of all, mostly people who don't need it ask about it. And second of all, their expectations and hopes for what it's going to do are vastly just unrealistic. And lastly, they don't anticipate all of the negative side effects and responsibilities and all the things that come with it.
Okay. Protein powder, overrated or underrated?
Underrated. I'll say it. Fuck it. There's a lot of these people that always say, like, you don't need protein powder. You can just have whole food. And that's true as far as it goes, but it doesn't go very far because, protein powder has it's super easy to pack and to travel with and to mix. And it's a great way to boost your protein intake. So protein powder is just like a really good tool you can use. And not lately, but over the course of the entire existence of, I think, the nutritional industry, especially formally trained folks in nutrition, to have this dogmatic revulsion to supplements. Oh, protein powders, you don't need it. Like, yeah, I know I don't need it, but in my case, it just makes my life 50 times easier. Another hilarious thing that people say, just have no idea what they're talking about, is they'd be like, well, you just eat whole food, like it's cheaper. Like, no, it's not. Protein powder is dirt fucking cheap unless you're getting ripped off by somebody. Protein powder per gram of protein is some of the cheapest ways to get protein. It's also cheap. So protein powder is a great tool. There's a lot of people trying, for some reason, to eat as much whole food as possible. They think protein powder is unhealthy. They think it's expensive. They think it's pointless. And they're wrong on all fronts. And if they were logically approaching the issue with no attachment to one or the other, they would use, drumroll, a combination of protein powder and whole foods, which is probably what most people pursuing fitness could probably use best.
What about beef jerky?
I hate it. I fucking hate it. Overrated. Here's why. Beef jerky tastes fine. Anyone who says beef jerky tastes good is an insane person who's never had pizza or any other food before. And then secondly, two things happen with me. One is, it doesn't matter how much I brush or floss. If I eat more than 3 meals of beef jerky, which if you're on a road trip, that tends to happen, it gets stuck in my teeth and it starts to wear away at my gums. And I'm like, there's blood everywhere. It's terrible. And the other thing is there's so much salt. Yeah, it's awful. I'm telling you, it's like a crocodile attack. And then there's so much salt in it that it starts to burn the roof of my mouth and stuff like that. And I get bloated and it doesn't taste good. And beef jerky has this connotation of manliness. Like, I'm a man, I eat beef jerky. Like, right on. Pasta's better than beef jerky. That's right. I said it.
That's it. What about Twinkies?
Astrid, it's been years since I've had a Twinkie.
Or a ho-ho.
Ho-hos. Ho-hos are good. Underrated because they're not that bad. You can have a Twinkie. The funny thing is there's lots of snacks that are super tasty and kind of addicting, like potato chips or whatever. You can eat a trillion. And whenever I had a Twinkie, every now and again, I'll forget how a Twinkie tastes. And every 3 years I'll have one. And then I'll eat the Twinkie and I'll be like, wow, that was a thing. And then someone's like, another one. And I'm like, nope, I don't want another one for 3 years. It's fine. And then I've had enough. But so for me, Twinkies are great. And people are like, oh my God, they're so gross. They're not gross. And then people are like, oh my God, they're so good. They're not that good. So Twinkies are fine, which is it's good. So underrated.
Okay. What about pre-workouts?
I don't take pre-workout. I have enough demons. I don't need to be any more energetic. But I will say overrated because a lot of people could just have like a cup of black coffee and make it nice and strong. And that's as much caffeine as you'll need. And if you think like, oh, but there's more caffeine in pre-workout, like, well, yeah, we just have more caffeine from coffee. Have an espresso, have two, and you'll probably save some money. And you'll get just as much caffeine, which is, as far as I can tell, the only active ingredient in pre-workout, or 95% of the variance is explained by the caffeine. Although if you have a pretty cheap pre-workout that tastes good and is one of those crazy fruity flavors, and it really helps you on your hard sessions, go to it. I think that's great.
Stomach vacuuming.
Like practicing vacuums?
I guess.
Overrated. So when I get lean, I can hit a pretty cool vacuum pose. People always ask, like, tips for training the vacuum. I'm like, I don't know. I just fucking practice posing. I'm not sitting there fucking vacuuming all the damn time. It's like a cool thing to be able to do, but a lot of people look even better without a vacuum than with one. Jared Feather, pro bodybuilder, when he hits a vacuum, it kind of looks great because he looks amazing. But when he hits a regular abs flex pose, it looks even better. And so people always tell him, you should hit a vacuum. And he's like, I already have. It looks like shit. I think, the vacuum is probably overrated, mostly because of how many people ask questions about a vacuum. And you click on their profile and they're like 25% body fat. And you're like, why are you asking about a vacuum? You'll never see a vacuum in your entire life for like another 3 years. That was mean. But, it's all jokes.
Last two questions. Carb backloading.
So carb backloading is a concept I think originated and popularized by this one gentleman from back in the day that did the carb night diet and all that stuff. It's not really a term that is a necessity to have. It's just organizing your carbohydrates around your workout, and your workout is in the evening. Wildly overrated. It has no big benefits, probably some downsides as well. It's not some kind of magical fat loss tool. About like 6 to 8 years ago, it was a huge fad, and I hated it then, and I hate it now.
What about protein preloading when it comes to eating tons of protein before you go eating out or something that you're going to do outside, just because you might not have control over the foods you're going to choose or you're going to eat, so you're likely to eat less?
Oh, that's okay. I prefer like a green veggie preloading, because if you have a huge plate of like a bunch of green veggies, you really don't want to eat much after, and then you can go to the restaurant and have some normal food, but just in smaller quantities. I'd say protein preloading, probably overrated. I don't really know anyone who really pulls this off super well. I'm not sure.
Okay. And last one, breakfast. Overrated or underrated?
Yeah, majorly overrated. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day. It's something that I was actually talking to my wife about this. It's something that somebody just made up whole cloth. It just like came out of their mouth, manufactured entirely. Breakfast doesn't have some kind of special effect on your metabolism. It doesn't have any kind of special effect on fat loss or muscle gain. It's just one of the many meals of the day. I'd say the most important meal of the day is probably your post-workout meal. Number 2 is your pre-workout meal. Number 3 is your pre-bedtime meal, because it sets up your muscle gain or fat loss before you go to sleep and can affect your sleep. I'd say like that's 3 meals I can think of that are objectively more important than breakfast. Relegating,
okay.
If you go out in the street and say, hey, what do you guys think? Breakfast, most important meal? Everyone's like, yeah, so definitely overrated.
Okay. Is there any particular consideration that you would say it is important for this population, perhaps, or like more specifically talking about someone who might benefit from prioritizing breakfast?
People who need mental and physical energy early in the morning, and who notice that when they have breakfast, they have more of it, which is probably most people. So I would say, school children, if you want to learn and stuff, it's good to have some fuel in your body. People who have jobs in which they feel more fueled up for the day, and mentally and physically, if they have breakfast, that's a really good idea. Breakfast, like every meal, is a meal that considers what came before and what needs to come after in order to optimize effect. And if that's the case, then yeah, breakfast is great. And here's the thing, I eat breakfast every day, but I don't think it's like some kind of crazy special meal. It's like super, super important.
I was just thinking about another question. What is your stance? So do you think is this overrated or underrated? Eating regular meals, mostly on the regular times, on a regular basis?
Underrated, specifically by the macro tracking situation. There's actually a very, very good amount of literature. I did a literature review about a year ago on it, internal literature review for RP, as we were designing a few products. It turns out regular meal scheduling can optimize body fat loss, energy levels, health as measured by objective measures, muscle mass, glucose control. So regular meals, like roughly eating at similar times every day, roughly having the same number of meals every day. What I mean by roughly, like some days you eat at 12 p.m., some days you eat at 10 a.m. Similar, that's okay. Some days you have 4 meals, some days you have 5. Totally fine. Even 6, totally fine. But if like one day you have one meal or two meals, another day you have 8 meals, one day you eat at 12 p.m., one day you eat your first meal at 4 p.m., that kind of sort of stochastic element tends to, by a small margin, be sub-ideal for keeping you lean and healthy. And that's just directly from research literature, and actually something I didn't know at all until I did that review to find out what the fuck was going on. So it turns out regular meals are a pretty good idea. And a lot of people who just do kind of macros eating, where they sort of just eat random shit throughout the day until they fill their bucket of macros, they're missing out by a small margin on that thing.
Do you think is that because of irregularities in the ghrelin hormone and the appetite regulation is something that could be affected as well, just by not regularly eating as regular as I could?
Yeah, that's probably a partial factor, but that might not be the only thing that's going on. There may be a few other mechanisms at work.
That's all I have for you today. It's been such a pleasure to see you. Is there anything that you have planned or any projects coming for you in the next couple of weeks or months?
Yes, the RP Diet app, the RP Diet Coach app, rather, by Renaissance Periodization, is getting a bunch of really cool updates. Right now, in the next week, you'll be able to change your macros from any meal and dump them into any other meal. You can already move meals around. In a few months, we'll be able to actually change the macros for the day instead of how the app recommends it. You'll be able to alter it to whatever you see fit. And that's sort of setting the stage for basically at the end of the summer, the app is going to be able to cater to very beginner people and folks that really know what they're doing and want all the customization in the world. So that's what we're working on now. And if you gave the RP Diet app a chance before and you're like, it's too restrictive, it's too rigid, come on back in a few months and maybe you like what you see.
Okay. And what about for you? Anything coming up? Preparation for something?
I am my work. That's all I have. I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but okay. So I'm going to be mass gaining. I'm mini cutting right now, preparing to mass gain. I'll mass gain through the summer, and I can't say too much. But pending the COVID situation stays at least the same, potentially better, I'm probably going to be coming to Australia in the fall. Ooh, I know, crazy, right? I'm super excited. I have a list of kangaroo mugshots that I'll be looking for so I can box them and win. So a lot of kangaroos going to get beat up in the fall.
That's very exciting. I hope to see you again then and when you come here.
I'm super excited. That'd be great.
That's awesome. Well, Mike, thank you so much for coming today, for having a chat with me. Is there any particular final questions, anything, any final message for the audience that has been watching you all this time along?
Yeah, stop arguing in the comments, guys. We're all friends. I read the comments. I see them coming up. There's this huge argument about some kind of creatine or citrulline and then just personal attacks. You know, we're all just dust in the wind, folks. Let's cooperate. So thank you so much for having me on. It's always a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure too. You have a great day.
Take care. You as well.
Night.
No, night
Bye-bye.
for me, day for you. Bye.